Today, we're in lesson 3 of our course, Understanding the Old Testament. And I just wanted to remind you that there is a link in the description of this lesson where you can download and work directly from a PDF worksheet that we have for the lesson. And this will have the things that we cover, as well as extra graphs or charts or maps or things like that. So you want to make sure that you check it out. Also, we will end the lesson by looking over the questions that are presented in that worksheet. So if you have not downloaded it yet, go ahead and take a minute to do that before you start this lesson. Last time we looked at the patriarchs, which included Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and we finished off by looking at Joseph. Today, we will be looking at Exodus. We're going to look at the escape from Egypt. We're going to look at Leviticus and the prescription for living. Then we're going to look at Numbers and the prescription for traveling. And we're going to end off today's lesson by looking at Deuteronomy and the centrality of the covenant. This is our lesson on Israel's early years. So those are the things we're going to be covering. But before we do any of that, let's set the stage for our transfer from the patriarchs. Many years after Joseph's death, the cry of the enslaved Israelites went up to God. We see this in Exodus chapter 2, verse 23. Now, God had not forgotten his covenant with Israel's patriarchs. Specifically, he remembered his promise that they would inhabit the land of Canaan. And now it was time to fulfill that promise. To do so, however, he would need a strong leader, an imperfect yet a righteous prophet to mediate between God and his people. Who he needed was Moses. Throughout this grueling ordeal of leading the disgruntled, rebellious Israelites to the land of their inheritance, Moses not only served as God's mouthpiece to the people, but he also interceded several times to calm God's wrath against the people. In this process, he became known as the Lord's friend. Yet Moses remained more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. Until the time of Jesus, no prophet could compare to Moses' example of mighty power and awesome deeds. So the last 4 books of the Pentateuch entwine the life of Moses with the journey of the Israelites to the promised land. And as we study Exodus through Deuteronomy, you're going to notice the contrast between the Israelites' rebellion and Moses' faithfulness. Laying out the background for Exodus. First of all, the word Exodus means escape or exit. Therefore, the book of Exodus is the narrative of the Israelites' escape from Egypt and their journey to Mount Sinai. It emphasizes 3 specific geographical locations. First, there is Israel in Egypt. This is in Exodus 1 through 12:36. It also shows us Israel in the desert. This is chapter 12, verse 37 through chapter 18, verse 21, and Israel at Mount Sinai. This is chapter 19 through chapter 40. Several generations passed between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. And according to Exodus 1, Abraham's descendants had become so numerous that the nation of Egypt, this is where they now lived, considered them a threat. The Pharaoh who was in power then did not remember Joseph and feared that the Israelites would rally up and turn against him. So, in order to keep this potential threat under control, the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites, and Pharaoh tried to limit their birth rate. And so he issued an order to drown all newborn Israelite male babies in the Nile River. It was during this time of slavery that Moses was born. Realizing after 3 months that she could no longer hide her baby boy, Moses' mother put him in a basket and put the basket in the Nile River. Now, Pharaoh's daughter found the Hebrew baby and named him Moses, and she took him into her family as her own son. As part of Pharaoh's family, Moses now would receive the best Egyptian education, and he was trained in the wisdom of the Egyptians. So here we see that Moses has been placed in this very fortunate, very unique situation, but all the time, God is preparing Moses for his very unique life mission. When Moses was 40 years old, Moses killed an Egyptian who was beating an Israelite. He then he fled to the desert of Midian, and this is where God continued to train him for 40 years. It is also there that he married his wife, Zipporah. This was the daughter of Jethro, who was a priest of Midian. Exodus chapter 3 records Moses' divine encounter with God at the burning bush. It was here that Moses voiced many objections to God, ranging from, "Who am I? What shall I tell them? What if they do not believe me?" to, "Hey, please send somebody else to do it." And it's funny because we always think that the people that God called in the Bible were just jumping and just excited and waiting for God to send them and use them. But most of the time, they had a reaction much like Moses. "God, you've got the wrong guy. Just send someone else to do it." Now, God allowed Moses' brother Aaron to help, but God did not release Moses from the call to deliver his people, the nation of Israel. So, looking at the themes of Exodus, we see that the major themes of Exodus are deliverance, covenant, and divine mystery. We see the people of God were languishing under the heavy bondage of the Egyptians. They had no leadership. They had no hope, no plan of escape. But God was moved by his grace and by his earlier commitment to the patriarchs. And so he delivered his people by providing the necessary human leader, again, Moses. Now, although Moses is the primary human character of the Exodus narratives, remember that he is just a character in God's story. The real story is the redemptive work of Yahweh in delivering Israel from slavery in Egypt and in establishing a unique covenant relationship with the nation. So now that we've kind of got background on this and we've looked at the theme of Exodus, we can now look at the outline of Exodus. And I've put this outline in your worksheet. So looking at the outline of Exodus, we can break it down like so. First of all, we have God delivers Israel from slavery. This is chapter 1 through chapter 13, verse 19. So we see oppression in Egypt. We see preparation of Moses. We see the contest between God and Pharaoh. We see the Passover and the Exodus. Then we see them move from Egypt to Sinai. And this is in chapter 13, verse 19 through chapter 19, verse 2. We see here God's deliverance, and we see them on the way to Sinai. The third thing that you'll notice is God's covenant with Israel. So this picks up in chapter 19, verse 3, and moves through chapter 24, verse 18. Here we see preparing to meet with God. We see God giving the 10 commandments, the laws for Israel. We see the approving of the covenant. And then we see the tabernacle. Now this covers chapter 25 through chapter 40. So they're preparing to build. There's idolatry, there's judgment, and then there is building the tabernacle. So I want to look at these in greater detail, starting with the deliverance from slavery that's found in Exodus 1 through 13, verse 16. God used Moses to lead his people out of Egypt. However, the deliverance from slavery did not come immediately. Moses faced many challenges, including a tremendous lack of cooperation from his own people and serious conflict with Pharaoh, the ruler of the land. Moses also dealt with personal struggles while waiting for God's ultimate deliverance. In chapters 5 through 11, we see the contest between God and Pharaoh. Despite divine action through signs and wonders, Pharaoh continued to respond negatively. In fact, Exodus 7 through 11 is a very interesting account of interactions between God, Moses, and Pharaoh. When God promised to punish Egypt, Pharaoh reacted, and divine judgments were carried out through plagues. As God used Moses in the arena of the supernatural, an amazing story emerges of a series of power encounters between God and those who would challenge him. God is the one who performed the miracles. Moses was merely the human instrument. Moses acted in miracle power only when God spoke. Exodus chapter 15, verse 11 asks, "Who among the gods is like you, Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders?" Thus, neither the affliction of Israel nor the plagues of Egypt were outside of God's control. Pharaoh, the Egyptians, and all of Israel would see the power of God. In chapters 12 through 13, verse 16, we see the Passover account unfold. So before the last plague, God commanded the Israelites to spread lamb's blood on the doorframes of their homes. Seeing the blood, the angel of death would pass over the Israelites' houses and went only to the Egyptian homes where there was no blood on the doorposts. That night, as the angel brought death to every firstborn son of the Egyptians, the Israelites were to prepare for their journey and to be ready to go at any moment. Their deliverance was about to become a reality. The Lord instructed his people to commemorate the angel of death's passing over them with an annual feast called the Passover. The Passover's connection with the last plague is significant because the Israelites obeyed God by sacrificing a lamb, eating its meat, and spreading its blood on their doorposts. They were spared. Lambs had died in place of sons. In this way, the sacrifice of the Passover lamb served as the biblical model of redemption. That is, innocent blood was shed so that human life might be saved. On this night, Yahweh was especially alert and watchful over his people. The Israelites too watched and waited for the coming release from bondage. In the New Testament, the Lord's Supper serves a similar purpose of redemption and of anticipation. In chapters 13, verse 17 through 19, verse 2, we see the exit from Egypt. The shortest way from Egypt to Canaan was a well-traveled road along the Mediterranean Sea coast. However, knowing that Pharaoh would follow the Israelites, God told Moses to go another way. The Lord had a plan for Pharaoh. After the Israelites passed through a sea, God brought the waters back on Pharaoh's army in such great force and amounts that the army drowned. Now, biblical scholars, even conservative ones, do not agree on the route of the Exodus and which sea the Israelites crossed. Since the Hebrew word literally means sea of reeds, some teachers believe that the Israelites crossed a marshy body of water. Larry McQueen explains this view this way. It appears that God led the people around by the desert road, because the coastal road was heavily fortified with Egyptian outposts. They took instead the desert road toward the Red Sea, or Yam Suf, because Suf means papyrus or reeds. A better translation is Reed Sea or Sea of Reeds. Now, in some texts, Yam Suf is given a wide meaning to refer to the Gulf of Suez or the Gulf of Aqaba, the two bodies of water that extend out to the Red Sea. Following the literal meaning of Yam Suf, however, most scholars believe that the Israelites crossed what was known as the Sea of Reeds. It was probably a marshy, freshwater lake that could support the growth of papyrus. The only freshwater lake in the area is the Lake of Timsah, lying to the north of the Gulf of Suez and to the south of Lake Menzala. This area also fits well with the testimony of Scripture. Now, that's how Larry McQueen explains this whole idea of the Sea of Reeds and the lake idea. On the other hand, scholar Leon Wood contends that because the water drowned the Egyptians, we know that the sea had deep water and was not marshy. According to Wood, the size of the Israelite population and the time it would take such a large population to cross is more consistent with the Bitter Lakes, which at that time were considered an extension of the Red Sea or the Gulf of Suez. Wood also asserts that not enough is known about possible Egyptian fortifications in that day to draw a definite conclusion against his particular viewpoint. Now, although both of these views have elements that encourage serious consideration, their weak logical arguments prevent a definite conclusion. Whatever view you adopt, the Bible text is clear about one thing. This was a series of God-orchestrated miracles that won the Israelites their deliverance from their Egyptian slave masters. In chapters 19, verse 3 through 24, verse 18, we see God's covenant with Israel. So Israel's religion was a revealed religion. That is, their beliefs were not based on the religions of the people around them, but they came directly from God. While some of Israel's religious practices were similar to those of other nations, there were major theological differences. For instance, God told the Israelites exactly how they were to worship him, the only true God, and how they could receive forgiveness of sin. Earlier, God had made a covenant with Abraham and his family. Now, here at Sinai, God made a covenant with Israel as a nation. Having delivered Israel from Egypt, God desired that Israel be a holy nation to accomplish his purpose of salvation for all nations. The only way for Israel to have a right relationship with God was through his covenant. Grace came before the law. A covenant relationship is very different from legalism. In strict legalism, if one party breaks the contract, the other party is free to leave with no strings attached. However, in a covenant, sin hurts and it grieves the injured party. The covenant, however, continues as long as the initiator wills it. Therefore, the event of the Exodus and the giving of the covenant may be seen as the crux of the entire Old Testament. This was not a covenant that made Israel the people of God. That had been accomplished long before through God's covenant with Abraham. Rather, the covenant that was about to be implemented would give Israel the opportunity to be God's servant people, the channel by which he would communicate and transmit his redemptive program to the entire world. Chapter 20, verse 1 through 17, establishes the commandments. As part of his covenant with the nation of Israel, God issued the 10 Commandments to Moses, and Moses conveyed the instructions to the people. These instructions were given to protect both the individual and the nation. Their purpose was to prevent injustices and unfair treatment of others. The 10 Commandments, sometimes called the Decalogue, were the constitution of the covenant community, and the remaining laws are amendments or clarifications of the commandments. The 10 Commandments were unique because they required monotheism. This is the worship of the one true God. Although the surrounding nations worshipped many gods and made idols to represent them, Israel did not, and God commanded them not to. They were different from the other nations because they knew the living God. However, the Israelites' obedience to the covenant was very short-lived. While Moses was on the mountain and he was receiving the tablets and the instruction for the tabernacle, the people grew restless, and in direct violation of the first and second commandments, they demanded a visible God to worship. Aaron, who was supposed to be helping in the situation, promptly granted their request by making a calf from gold supplied by the people themselves. They held a feast. They bowed before the calf as the God that delivered them from Egypt. In this act, which betrayed the heart of the covenant, the Israelites broke their promise of obedience, and they suffered the consequences. Because of their sin, the Lord inflicted them with a plague. Yet, through Moses' intercession and through God's own grace, the Lord restored his covenant relationship with his people. Finally, Exodus chapters 20 through 40 introduces to the tabernacle. Whereas the Egyptians had many temples, Israel had only one place of worship. God placed Bezalel and Aholiab in charge of building the tabernacle, which was often called the tent of meeting in the Bible. Now, Bezalel and Aholiab were filled with God's Spirit, with knowledge, and with skills. It's here that we see that the Bible seems to indicate that the Holy Spirit empowers human ability, talents, and intellect, and he does it in order to accomplish God's purposes. The tabernacle itself was 45 feet long and 15 feet wide and 15 feet high, with two major divisions: the holy place and the most holy place, also called the Holy of Holies. Since the entrance to the holy place was on the east side, the priest entered in the morning with the rising sun. A thick curtain or a veil separated the holy place from the most holy place, which was square in its design. So that takes us through the Exodus. And now we can look at Leviticus. The book of Leviticus offered the people of Israel a prescription for living. The book of Leviticus establishes the rituals that were to characterize Israel's religious practice in the days of the law. It's in these pages that God gave specific instructions for how the people were to worship him with their lives. You'll find the outline of Leviticus in your worksheet, and it's broken down in this fashion. So first of all, you have the offerings. This is chapter 1 through 7. Then chapter 8 through 10 is about the priests. Chapter 11 through 22 is the laws. Chapter 23 through 25 is the feasts and holy days. And then chapter 26 and 27 give us the choice. So let's look at some of these. First of all, in chapters 1 through 7, we have the offerings. From the time of Adam and Eve, people brought offerings to God. Having chosen Israel to testify about his way of salvation, God now gave specific instructions about making sacrifices to express the people's repentance, faith, thankfulness, and love. The types of offerings are as followed. First, there was the burnt offering. This was a free act of worship. It atoned for unintentional sins, that is, those that were done without planning or desire, and it showed complete surrender to God. Then you have the grain offering. This is a giving of thanks and praise to God for his goodness and for his provisions. It was offered with a burnt offering or a fellowship offering, but it was never offered alone. Now, the fellowship offering was a free act of worship. The priests and the person bringing this offering ate part of it together to show fellowship between God and mankind. The sin offering. This was required for certain unintentional sins. Forgiveness and cleansing from sins were to be confessed with this offering. The guilt offering was required to atone for unintentional sins. It was required restitution and a fine of 20%. This was necessary to restore relationships. So 4 of the 5 types of offerings here required blood sacrifices. And I've placed a chart. This is going to be figure 1 in your worksheet, and it breaks down the Old Testament sacrifices and the offerings. In chapters 8 through 10, we are introduced to the priests and we are shown what their roles are. In patriarchal times, the head of a family offered sacrifices for the entire family. Now, after the Exodus, priests were to offer sacrifices for anyone who was part of the national community. God chose Moses' brother Aaron to be the first high priest, and Aaron's sons would assist him. When 2 of his sons, this was Nadab and Abihu, failed to follow the prescribed divine pattern for worship, God judged them with death. The priestly ministry under the Levitical system differed significantly from that of the priests of other religions and cultures that were near Israel. According to the Lord's instructions, the priests represented the people before God and taught God's laws and principles to the people. They were also custodians of the tabernacle, with the Levites appointed to assist them. God commissioned the Levites to take the place of the firstborn males. The last thing that I want to look at in Leviticus are the feasts and the holy days found in chapters 23 through 25. God established special feasts and holy days to remind the Israelites that they were his holy people. The law outlined what to do on each occasion. And you're going to find a chart of these feasts and holy days. This is figure 2 in your worksheet. The theology of holiness permeates the entire book of Leviticus. It affirms both the holiness of God and the propensity of people toward sin. Yet God desires his people to move toward holiness, and he provides the sacrifice for sin. Therefore, the theology of holiness undergirds the sacrifices, the role of the priests, and the feast celebrations. So, if the book of Leviticus offered the people of Israel a prescription for living, then the book of Numbers would offer a prescription for traveling. For almost a year, Israel camped at Mount Sinai where God gave them instructions. Later, the Israelites marched for 11 days to Kadesh. From there, Moses sent spies into the land of Canaan, but their report caused the people to turn away from God and to doubt and to be filled with unbelief. So God punished the Israelites by allowing the faithless generation to die in the wilderness. Finally, after almost 40 years, Israel's next generation was ready to enter Canaan, and Moses gave his farewell speeches in Deuteronomy to the nation of Israel. The outline of Numbers, which is in your worksheet, can be divided into three parts. First, we have them at Sinai, then we have them at Kadesh, and then we have them at Moab. It's also important to note that the chapters in Numbers are not written in the order of events. So let's run through the outline quickly, and then we will break it down. So at Sinai, this is chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 10, verse 10. God prepares Israel to inherit Canaan. They're preparing to march. They're establishing camp rules. They're dedicating the tabernacle, and they're following divine guidance to Canaan. At Kadesh, the people forfeit their inheritance. So this is chapter 10, verse 11 through chapter 21, verse 35. There is complaints and an outpouring of the Spirit. There is rebellion with the 10 spies. There are 38 years of wandering. And then we see them move from Kadesh to the plains of Moab. At Moab, God prepares a new generation to possess Canaan in chapter 22 through chapter 36. So it's here where we see stories like that of Balak and Balaam. We see the second census. We see Joshua, the new leader. We see commands about offerings, feasts, and vows. We see war with Midian and a dividing and settling of the land. In the first 4 chapters, we find Israel preparing to march. Before leaving Mount Sinai, Moses counted the men, but not the women, children, or Levites. Because of this, some scholars have concluded that there were 600,000 men alone. They estimate that by the time one adds women, children, and Levites, approximately 2 to 3 million Israelites left Egypt. Considering that they traveled from place to place, this is an incredible number of people. In chapter 5, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 21, we find God establishing the camp rules with the people. In order to keep the Israelites holy, God established laws concerning cleanliness and health, tests for an unfaithful wife, and the Nazirite vow. These were some among others. Whereas the health laws were for their physical benefit, the holiness laws were for their spiritual benefit. Some individuals took a Nazirite vow. This was a special sign of devotion that called for abstinence from several things, including the consumption of wine. The third thing we see in chapter 6, verse 22 through chapter 9, verse 16 is Moses dedicating the tabernacle. So after construction of the tabernacle and its furniture was completed, Moses performed an act of dedication, and God's glory filled the tabernacle. Consequently, the tabernacle became the center of Israel's religious life. Through Moses, God set apart Aaron and the Levites to minister in it. God also instructed the priests to say a specific blessing, which is now called the Aaronic blessing, over the people to set them apart as his. 1 year after the deliverance from Egypt, the Lord reminded the Israelites to celebrate the Passover. All strangers traveling with the Israelites could choose to participate in the celebration as well. In chapter 9, verse 17 through chapter 10, verse 10, we see the people of Israel following divine guidance to Canaan. When the Israelites camped, the tabernacle was to be the center of the camping activity, with the Levites camped around it. The cloud of God's glory would cover the tabernacle. In chapter 9, verse 17, we read, "When the cloud lifted from above the tent, the Israelites set out. Wherever the cloud settled, the Israelites encamped." In this way, as the Israelites continued their wilderness journey, God guided them by a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night. In chapter 10, verse 11 to chapter 12, verse 16, this is where we begin to see complaints and an outpouring of the Spirit. During this trek, the Israelites began to forget the conditions of slavery in Egypt, focusing instead on their present negative circumstances. They consistently complained, and they turned against both God and Moses. When God provided manna for food, they demanded meat. God then provided quail, and they had more than enough to eat. However, God became so angry about their ungrateful, selfish attitudes that he punished them, once with fire and once with a plague that killed many. Now Moses, who, as I mentioned, was the go-between, Moses cried out to God because the burden of carrying so much emotional weight was becoming too heavy. And God told him to choose 70 men who would share the burden and responsibilities of leading the people. God poured out his Spirit on these individuals so they would be empowered to carry out the task. Human responsibility and delegation, as well as divine empowerment, are necessary to fulfill God's assignments for us. Yet the Israelites' negative attitude continued. Their complaints led even Aaron and Miriam to criticize Moses. They were jealous that Moses had all the authority, and as a result, God rebuked Aaron and Miriam because of their rebellion and caused Miriam to have leprosy for 7 days. In this way, he let everyone know that Moses was his chosen leader. Chapters 13 and 14 show us the rebellion with the 10 spies. As Israel camped in the desert of Paran, Moses sent 12 spies to the land of Canaan. Upon returning, they reported that the land was good and it was fruitful. However, 10 of the spies did not believe Israel could conquer Canaan because of the great strength and size of the people living there. In fact, only Joshua and Caleb stood firm in faith and proclaimed that with God's help, Israel could take the land. Now, the people believed the faithless spies. They talked of rejecting Moses as their leader, and they threatened to stone Joshua and Caleb. In response, God told Moses that he would destroy the people and begin a new nation. But Moses prayed, Moses interceded for the Israelites, and although God forgave them as Moses asked, he proclaimed that all of the unbelieving adults would die in the wilderness. Chapters 15 through 19 shows how this rebellion led to 38 years of wandering. As a result of God's judgment, the Israelites spent 38 years wandering in the desert around Kadesh. During this time, two groups turned against God and his chosen leaders. So God sent judgment against these rebels, and the ground opened up and swallowed them and their families. God also confirmed Aaron as high priest by bringing Aaron's rod to life and having it blossom and produce almonds. It was later placed in the Ark of the Covenant, according to Hebrews chapter 9, verse 4. Finally, in chapter 20 and 21, we see Israel make their way from Kadesh to the plains of Moab. While in Kadesh, a crisis arose when the multitude had no water. Again, the people grumbled and they complained against Moses' leadership, and God told Moses to speak to a rock so that water would flow from it. But Moses became angry, and instead he struck the rock, although water still came from the rock. Moses' disobedience caused the Lord to bar him from entering the promised land. Finally, after 38 years in the wilderness, the Israelites arrived at the border, continuing to complain. God punished them by sending deadly snakes into the camp. When they repented and Moses prayed for them, God provided a way for them to live. If a person who was bitten looked upon the snake of bronze that Moses placed on a pole, he or she would live. Later, Jesus used this as an illustration of the life that he would offer through his death. From there, Israel traveled south and went around the regions of Edom and Moab. God did not allow them to fight against Moab, the nation where Ruth would later come from. But they conquered Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan. As they camped on the plains north of Moab, God gave them further instructions for entering Canaan. The book of Numbers ends at Moab. Chapters 22 through 36 tell us of this time. The book of Numbers ends at Moab in chapters 22 through 36. The last division of Numbers shows God's protection of Israel from Balak and the prophet Balaam. There is no sorcery against Jacob, no divination against Israel. Chapter 23, verse 23. It also describes God's judgment on the Israelites who turned to Moab idols and who turned to immorality. In the midst of this judgment, Eleazar's son, Phinehas, defended God's honor and ended the plague that God had sent. The Lord commended him for his zeal and promised his family a lasting priesthood. Numbers 26 describes the second census, which showed that the number of fighting men was still at 600,000. However, this generation was ready to trust God and possess the promised land. Moses announced that Joshua, now filled with the Spirit, would be the new leader of Israel. In this final portion of Numbers, we also read of the settlement of the land east of the Jordan by the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. We read of the establishment of the boundaries of the Promised Land and of the instructions given regarding the cities of refuge. Each of these cities would be a place of safety where an Israelite who accidentally killed a person would be able to escape. And that brings us to our final section in this lesson, looking at Deuteronomy and the centrality of the covenant. Now, the word Deuteronomy comes from the Greek title of this book in the Septuagint. Deutero means second, and nomi is a form of the word law. So the book of Deuteronomy reviews the law and covenant that God gave to Israel. The book of Deuteronomy does not give a second law, as the name suggests, but rather it provides an important summary of the history of the wilderness period and organization of the legal material. Framed in the words of Moses shortly before his death, the book tries to give the Israelites a broad perspective of the events of the previous generation, as it affords the opportunity for the renewal of the covenant. The outline of Deuteronomy, which is once again in your worksheet, proceeds as follows. It starts with Moses's first message and the history. So this is a review of Israel's failures. This is encouragement to obey. This is talk of cities of refuge. And all of this takes place in chapter 1 through chapter 4, verse 43. Then we see Moses' second message of law and love. We see the covenant, the 10 commandments, the laws for living in Canaan, and Moses' third message on blessings or curses. The second message is chapter 4, verse 44 through chapter 26, verse 19. This is covering a lot of the book. And then the third message covers chapter 27 through chapter 30. We also see Moses' final words and read of his death. So he commissions Joshua. There's a song and blessing of Moses, and then the death of Moses. So let's look at each of these. In chapter 1 through chapter 4, verse 43, we have Moses' first message to the people of Israel. In his first speech, he reviews Israel's history, giving attention to both positive and negative aspects. He addresses the people's tendency to consistently complain and to turn away from God so often that God disallowed them from entering Canaan. Moses also reminded the people that the divine promises were conditional, involving obedience that was rooted in love for God. In Moses' second speech, which again is chapter 4, verse 44 through chapter 26, verse 19, this is centered on the concept of the covenant. Once again, he emphasizes the conditional aspect of the covenant. That is, the divine blessing, which is dependent on obedience, which is rooted in love. A continual, consistent disobedience would lead the people away from God's blessings, and it would destroy their relationship with God. Moses' second message contains 5 familiar passages or concepts. First, we have a repetition of the 10 commandments, including the exhortations to remove idol worship and all those who worshiped idols. We have the Jewish confession of faith, or a brief doctrinal statement. This confession of faith, which is called the Shema, which is an imperative that means hear, is something that many faithful Jewish believers still quote every day. The New Testament refers to this Old Testament passage and affirmation of the one true God several times, and you may be familiar with it. It is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." We also see exhortations to love God, their neighbors, and the foreigners among them, followed by many ethical standards for living and prophecy of a coming prophet. This prophecy was fulfilled in Jesus Christ. John chapter 1 verse 45 tells us, "Philip found Nathanael and told him, 'We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph.'" John chapter 6 verse 14 says, "After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, 'Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world.'" And Acts chapter 3 verses 22 through 26 tell us, "For Moses said, 'The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own people. You must listen to everything he tells you. Anyone who does not listen to him will be completely cut off from their people.' Indeed, beginning with Samuel, all the prophets who have spoken have foretold these days, and you are heirs of the prophets and of the covenant God made with your fathers. He said to Abraham, 'Through your offspring, all peoples on earth will be blessed.' When God raised up his servant, he sent him first to you to bless you by turning each of you from your wicked ways." Moses' third speech, which is chapters 27 through 30, involves blessings or curses. Although such a speech is unfamiliar and may be hard for Western cultures to understand, it was common in ancient Near Eastern cultures. A message of blessings and curses is sometimes called a doctrine of retribution. Though Deuteronomy's doctrine of retribution was certainly true, it's not the whole picture because it deals with the immediate future. Israel will succeed in the promised land only if she is faithful to the covenant. On the other hand, if she disobeys, she will lose the land. The rest of biblical revelation broadens the scope by teaching that character ultimately has to do with one's eternal destiny. The circumstances of this life may have little to do with one's character. Someone born blind cannot be accused of being in that condition because of sin. And people killed tragically in accidents have not met untimely death because of sin. In his farewell address, chapter 31 through 34, Moses commissioned Joshua to be the new leader. God revealed to Moses that the people would bow to idols, and he gave Moses a song to teach them as a witness against them. Moses instructed the priests to place the law in the Ark of the Covenant, and he spoke a blessing over each tribe. Then God told Moses to climb Mount Nebo, and from there he could see the land that Israel was about to enter. Now God himself buried Moses on Mount Nebo. And after mourning for Moses, the Israelites, now led by Joshua, went on to the promised land. Now, before we review our lesson, let's take a moment to look at your homework for the week. So your homework for the week is to read one of the books that we discussed today: Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, or Deuteronomy. So what I would encourage you to do is to follow the outline for the specific book in the worksheet to break up your reading. And you should be able to read any one of these books within 3 to 5 days by utilizing the outline. Again, if you want to listen to this in an audio version, whether you just listen to it or whether you are listening to it while you read it, that's fine too. I would suggest that you keep the same translation as the Bible that you're using, but listening to it is perfectly fine. And also, I want to remind you, I call this homework for the week. This was a class that I taught at my church, and we went through stuff week by week. I will also continue to upload videos, lessons in this course week by week. If you need to take more time to work through this, especially dealing with like the books of the law and things like that, go ahead. It's important that you get an understanding of what you're reading, more so than just jumping into the next lesson. So take your time, but work through it, listen to it however you want to do it. Make sure that you're getting something out of it, though. Make sure that it's not just, oh, I have to check this off before I can move on to the next lesson kind of attitude that you're coming at it with, but that you want to learn, that you want to, as the course name suggests, understand the Old Testament, because a lot of people have trouble in this area. So looking at our lesson review, the first question is, what does Exodus mean? And of course, Exodus means escape or exit. What are some of the major themes of Exodus? Well, this would include deliverance, covenant, and divine mystery. What did the book of Leviticus establish? It established the rituals that were to characterize Israel's religious practice in the days of the law. Question 4, what were the priests' duties? The priests represented the people before God. They taught God's laws, and they were custodians of the tabernacle. Question 5, what does the book of Numbers summarize? This is a summary of the nomadic lives of the Israelites and notes of their travels. Question 6, what does Deuteronomy mean? Deuteronomy means second law. Question 7, what does Deuteronomy provide a summary of? This was the wilderness period and organization of the legal material. What 5 concepts do we see in Moses' second message? We see a repetition of the 10 Commandments. We see the Jewish confession of faith. We see exhortations to love God, neighbors, and foreigners. We see ethical standards for living. And we see prophecy of a coming prophet.